The crystal chandeliers gleamed like knives as I stood in the corner of the ballroom, holding a glass of champagne I couldn't bring myself to sip. The grand ballroom at the Waterstone Hotel smelled of expensive perfume, red wine, and the particular stench of corporate arrogance that comes with retirement parties for men who never deserved their positions. My ex-boss, Cliff Rowan, was on stage, smirking like a man who believed he owned the air everyone breathed. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his tuxedo custom-fitted, his confidence unearned and absolute. "Let's all raise a glass," he said, his voice carrying across the room of 200 guests, "to the people who didn't quite make it here tonight. People like Ava Cole, who thought she could run before she could walk." Laughter filled the room, cruel, knowing laughter. The clinking of glasses sounded like bullets ricocheting off my composure. I froze, every eye in the room turning toward me in my corner. He'd invited me here specifically for this. Just to humiliate me one final time. My dress suddenly felt too tight, my throat too dry, my hands trembling around the champagne flute. But I smiled anyway. Because what Cliff didn't know was that the boardroom he used to rule would soon have a new name on its door. Mine. Cliff had always been cruel, but tonight he was theatrical about it. He actually winked at me as the guests whispered and pointed. The spotlight operator even swung the light toward my corner, illuminating me like a specimen under glass. "Still working on that confidence, Ava?" he called out, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Or are you still unemployed? I heard the job market's been tough for people who overestimate their abilities." More laughter. The scent of champagne and arrogance mixed in the air, making me nauseous. I clenched my jaw so tightly my teeth hurt, my manicured nails digging crescents into my palms. He'd loved making me feel small since my first day under him 5 years ago. Every meeting, every presentation, every small victory I'd achieved, he'd found ways to diminish them all. But tonight, his arrogance was writing his own ending. He just didn't know it yet. I needed patience. Just a few more minutes of patience, and everything would change. 3 years ago, I was his executive assistant, his shadow, really. The person who made him look competent while he took all the credit. He'd bark orders across the office, his coffee breath hot in my face as he demanded I redo presentations I'd already perfected. He'd take my proposals, cross out my name, add his own, and present them to the board as his genius innovations. "You'll burn out before you ever rise, sweetheart," he'd said once, feet propped on his desk while I stood holding a stack of reports. "Women like you, too ambitious, too eager. You'll hit a wall. They always do." But I didn't burn out. I transferred to a subsidiary company 2 years ago. Built a small team from nothing. Grew their profits by 300% in 18 months. Turned a failing division into the company's biggest success story. And Cliff? He never noticed the name under those growth reports he bragged about to shareholders during quarterly meetings. Mine. I still remember the exact day he pushed me too far. It was a Tuesday morning, raining outside, the office smelling of wet carpet and burnt coffee from the break room pot that nobody ever cleaned properly. I'd spent all weekend finishing a market analysis report, 70 pages of research that could have saved the company millions. Cliff walked into the conference room where I was setting up, glanced at my carefully arranged presentation, and accidentally spilled his coffee across the report. The hot liquid spread across the pages, ruining hours of work. He didn't apologize. He laughed. "That's about the level of your work anyway, Ava. Soggy and unreadable." The other executives in the room looked away, uncomfortable but silent. The smell of burnt beans and ruined ink filled my nose as I cleaned up his mess with paper towels, my cheeks burning with humiliation. That day, I decided I'd never work for a man like him again. Next time, I'd work above him. When I resigned 3 months later, he didn't even look up from his computer screen. I placed my resignation letter on his desk, 2 weeks' notice, professional and cold, and waited for some acknowledgement. Any acknowledgement. He glanced at it, smirked, and muttered, "You'll crawl back. They always do. You're not built for the real world, Ava. You're built to be someone's assistant." I walked out without responding, leaving behind my badge, my office supplies, and the last piece of fear I would ever owe him. I left behind the version of myself who'd tolerated his cruelty, who'd absorbed his insults, who'd made herself smaller so he could feel bigger. That woman died in his office that afternoon. Someone stronger was born in the elevator on the way down. A year after leaving, I joined a small consulting firm called Eclipse Innovations. They were struggling, 3 partners, 12 employees, barely breaking even, operating out of a converted warehouse that smelled like fresh paint and desperation. But they had potential. Vision. And most importantly, they were willing to let me build something from the ground up. They gave me a team of 5 junior analysts and a directive: make us matter. Within 6 months, we'd landed 3 major contracts. Within a year, we'd doubled our revenue. Within 2 years, Eclipse Innovations was a recognized competitor in Cliff's industry, management consulting for Fortune 500 companies. And Cliff? He never realized who was behind the rookie rival firm that was quietly siphoning away his best clients. He never connected the dots. His arrogance made him blind. My team worked nights, weekends, and holidays. I slept on the office couch more than in my own bed, surviving on takeout containers and coffee that actually tasted good because we'd invested in a proper machine. We were hungry in a way Cliff's overpaid, complacent team could never understand. When our second-year quarterly results hit, we'd tripled revenue. Major investors started calling. Industry publications featured us in articles about disruptive newcomers changing the consulting landscape. My phone rang constantly with headhunters, competitors wanting to acquire us, clients wanting our magic formula. And then one call changed everything. It came on a Wednesday afternoon, rain pattering against the warehouse windows. A familiar voice I didn't immediately place: Ms. Cole, this is Gerald Whitmore from Rowan Consulting Group. We'd like to discuss a potential merger. Would you be available to meet? Rowan Consulting Group. Cliff's company. The universe had a sense of humor after all. The irony was almost too perfect. Cliff's company was collapsing, bloated with overpaid executives, outdated methodologies, and the toxic culture he'd cultivated like a cancer. Clients were leaving. Young talent refused to work there. The company's reputation had curdled from industry leader to dinosaur refusing extinction. The board was desperate for new leadership, fresh vision, someone who could stop the bleeding. They'd done their research on Eclipse Innovations, on me. But they didn't know I was Cliff's former assistant. They just saw a young CEO who'd turned chaos into cash, who'd built something from nothing, who represented everything their company needed to survive. Gerald Whitmore, the board chairman, laid out the offer in his corner office that smelled of leather and old money. We're prepared to offer a very generous merger package. Your expertise, our infrastructure. Together, we'd be unstoppable. I smiled, coffee cup warm in my hands. I'll think about it. Inside, I already knew my answer. But first, I wanted to do some research of my own. Behind closed doors, away from Cliff's knowledge, the board was already moving. They'd voted privately to sell controlling shares of the company, quietly, through a network of shell corporations and investment groups that couldn't be traced back to them immediately. They needed to save face while abandoning ship. Through my network of investors, mentors, and financial advisors, I began acquiring those shares. 10% here, 15% there, always through holding companies with names that meant nothing: Sterling Ventures, Cascade Holdings, Northpoint Investments. By the time Cliff announced his retirement 6 months later, forced out by a board that was tired of his failures, I already owned 62% of his company. But I didn't tell anyone. I wanted him to have one last party. One final moment of feeling like the king he'd never actually been. Because the higher he felt in that moment, the further he'd fall when reality arrived. His retirement invitation arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday, embossed in gold lettering on cream cardstock that probably cost more per square inch than my first apartment's rent. You are cordially invited to celebrate the legacy and career of Clifford James Rowan. Legacy. That word tasted both bitter and beautiful in my mouth. At the bottom, in his own handwriting, a personal note: Ava, despite our differences, I'd love for you to attend. Let's celebrate the past and look toward the future. Cliff. The condescension dripped from every word. He thought he was being magnanimous, inviting his former assistant to witness his triumph. He had no idea he was inviting me to his execution. I RSVP'd immediately, my response simple and professional: wouldn't miss it for the world. On the night of the event, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of my white satin suit. Not a dress, a suit. Tailored perfectly, elegant without being flashy, powerful without being aggressive. The opposite of what Cliff would expect from me. The opposite of the timid assistant who'd once fetched his coffee and absorbed his cruelty. My reflection showed someone I'd barely recognized from 3 years ago. Confident. Composed. Dangerous. As I drove to the Waterstone Hotel, Cliff's laugh from the ballroom already echoed in my imagination. He didn't know the storm had already signed his replacement letter. He didn't know his throne had a new occupant. He was about to perform at his own funeral and call it a celebration. When he raised his glass and toasted to those who almost mattered, the room erupted in laughter. I kept my smile sharp, practiced, revealing nothing. My champagne remained untouched. I needed complete clarity for what was coming. You look surprised to be here, Ava, he said, walking toward my corner with his entourage of sycophants trailing behind. I wasn't sure you'd have the courage to face your former colleagues after, well, you know, your departure. The way he said departure made it sound like a failure instead of a choice. The crowd leaned in, hungry for drama. I met his eyes calmly. Oh Cliff, you have no idea how much I've been looking forward to tonight. He thought it was weakness disguised as politeness. His smirk widened. But the board members standing near the stage, I caught them watching me with expressions that weren't mockery. They knew. They'd seen the papers. They were waiting for me to strike. But revenge is best enjoyed slowly, savored like expensive wine. I noticed the board chairman, Gerald Whitmore, whispering to the CFO near the stage. Both kept glancing between Cliff's performance and my position in the corner. The company's general counsel, Patricia Vance, stood with them, her face carefully neutral but her eyes sharp. They knew what was coming. They'd orchestrated parts of it. Other executives I recognized from my assistant days watched with varying degrees of discomfort. Some had witnessed Cliff's cruelty toward me and said nothing. Others had participated, laughing at his jokes at my expense, treating me like furniture that occasionally spoke. Now they shifted uncomfortably, sensing something in the air had changed but not understanding what. The mood in the room felt electric, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. Cliff was oblivious, drunk on attention and whiskey, performing for an audience that was about to turn on him. I stayed in my corner, silent, waiting. Patience has brought me this far. Patience would carry me through the final act. Just as Cliff raised his glass for what was clearly meant to be his grand final toast, some prepared speech about legacy and leadership that his assistant had probably written, the microphone cut out. The feedback screech made everyone wince. Then the chairman's voice came through the speakers, clear and authoritative. Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude Mr. Rowan's retirement celebration, the board has an important announcement regarding the company's future leadership. Cliff froze mid-gesture, his glass still raised, confusion crossing his face. This wasn't in the script. He glanced at Gerald, who avoided his eyes. What's going on? Cliff asked, his microphone suddenly live again, his confusion broadcast to the entire room. Gerald stepped to the podium, Cliff's microphone cutting out. As you all know, Rowan Consulting Group has undergone significant transitions this year. Tonight, we're pleased to formally introduce our new Chief Executive Officer, who will be taking the helm effective immediately. The applause began before anyone knew who they were clapping for. Cliff's face went from confused to pale. He was looking around frantically now, trying to understand how his retirement party had been hijacked. I stepped out of my corner, into the light. The collective gasp was electric, a sound I'd remember for the rest of my life. Heels clicking on marble, white suits glowing under the chandeliers. I walked toward the stage with my head high and my hands steady. "Everyone," Gerald announced, with genuine warmth in his voice, "please welcome Ms. Ava Cole, our new Chief Executive Officer of Rowan Consulting Group." Cliff's champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. The crash echoed through the suddenly silent room. Crystal shards scattered across polished stone, champagne pooling like spilled secrets. His face had gone completely white, mouth opening and closing without sound. "This is impossible," he finally whispered, but his microphone was off, so only the people nearest him heard. I took the microphone from Gerald, looked directly at Cliff, and smiled. "No, Cliff. It's not impossible. It's poetic." He stumbled backward, nearly falling, caught by his wife who looked equally shocked. "You can't, I built this company. 23 years. You were my assistant. You fetched my coffee." His voice was rising, losing the polished veneer he'd maintained all evening. The crowd was completely silent now, everyone frozen, watching this unscripted drama unfold. Some pulled out phones, recording. This would be all over social media within the hour. "And I rebuilt it," I replied calmly into the microphone. "While you were running it into the ground with outdated practices and a toxic culture, I was building Eclipse innovations into exactly what this company needed. The board made a smart choice merging our companies. They made an even smarter choice about who should lead it." Gerald stepped forward. "Mr. Rowan, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No." Cliff's face was red now, rage replacing shock. "This is my retirement party. My company. You can't just—" "Your company?" I interrupted gently. "Cliff, I own 62% of the shares. This hasn't been your company for 6 months. You just didn't know it yet." The silence that followed could have shattered glass. Then someone started clapping, slow, deliberate. Others joined. Within seconds, half the room was applauding while Cliff stood frozen in the center, his empire crumbling around him in real time. Cliff stormed out of the ballroom, his wife hurrying after him, his closest supporters trailing uncertainly. I watched him go without satisfaction or gloating, just a calm acknowledgement that a chapter had closed. The party continued awkwardly for another hour, people approaching me with congratulations that felt both genuine and self-serving. The next morning, every major business publication ran the story. The boardroom betrayal that redefined power. Former assistant becomes CEO of company that fired her. Ava Cole's revenge, a masterclass in patient corporate takeover. My phone exploded with interview requests, speaking opportunities, and messages from people I'd known throughout my career. Some called it betrayal. Some called it justice. I called it balance. Cliff had spent years making people feel small. Now he knew exactly how that felt. The universe had a way of teaching lessons to those who refused to learn them voluntarily. Over the next weeks, I discovered the rot Cliff had left behind. Embezzlement wasn't quite the right word, he'd been too clever for that. But there were questionable consulting contracts paid to companies his brother-in-law owned. Expense reports for client dinners at restaurants that had closed years ago. Equipment purchases that were never delivered. A culture of favoritism where promotions went to those who laughed at his jokes rather than those who did excellent work. We purged it all. Every corrupt policy is rewritten. Every barrier to advancement is dismantled. Every toxic manager is given a choice, change or leave. Most left. Good. The company didn't need people who'd enabled Cliff's reign. He'd run it like a monarchy, with himself as king and everyone else as subjects. I ran it like a mission, focused, efficient, collaborative. One night, 3 weeks after the retirement party, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Cliff's voice was different, smaller, older, defeated. "You destroyed everything I built," he said. Not angry. Just hollow. 23 years. Gone. My reputation. My legacy. Everything. I stood at my office window, looking out at the city lights, considering my response carefully. No, Cliff. You destroyed it when you forgot that companies are built by people, not egos. When you prioritized your comfort over your employees' dignity. When you took credit for work you didn't do and blamed others for failures that were yours. I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped enabling the destruction you were already causing. Silence on the line. Then, I made you who you are. I laughed, genuinely laughed. No. You made me want to prove you wrong. There's a difference. He hung up. That was the last time we ever spoke. Within 6 months, the transformation was remarkable. Employee satisfaction scores went from among the worst in the industry to among the best. Client retention rates that had been plummeting under Cliff's leadership stabilized and then climbed. Revenue didn't just recover, it soared. We landed contracts with companies that had refused to work with us under the old regime. The same investors who'd once questioned my age and experience now quoted my strategies in their own board meetings. Industry publications that had ignored us for years suddenly wanted to feature our turnaround story. I didn't do interviews initially. Let the work speak. Let the numbers tell the story. Success is louder than any press release. But I also didn't want simple revenge anymore. That feeling had faded somewhere between the retirement party and the 3rd month of rebuilding. Now I wanted legacy, the kind that's earned through excellence, not inherited through entitlement. At the next corporate gala 6 months later, the same annual industry event where Cliff had once strutted like a peacock, I accepted an award for leadership innovation. The ballroom was different this time, the atmosphere celebratory rather than cruel. I wore a navy suit and carried myself with quiet confidence rather than defensive armor. The chairwoman who presented the award whispered as she handed me the crystal trophy, "You didn't just take his chair, Ava. You changed the entire table." That's true power. For the first time since this journey began, I felt peace instead of triumph. The revenge had been satisfying for approximately 10 minutes. But this, building something better, creating a culture where talent mattered more than politics, proving that leadership could be effective without being cruel, this was the real victory. A journalist from a major business magazine requested an interview. I finally agreed, sitting in my office that still sometimes felt surreal, my name on the door, my vision driving the company, my rules creating the culture. She asked insightful questions about leadership, about navigating male-dominated industries, about the balance between ambition and ethics. Then she asked the question I'd been expecting: what did it feel like to walk into that retirement ballroom, knowing Cliff Rowan had invited you there to mock you one final time? I thought about it carefully, wanting to be honest without being cruel. It felt like closure wearing heels, I finally said. Like the universe giving me a chance to prove that his assessment of me was wrong. Not to him, he'd never admit it. But to myself. And to everyone who'd ever been made to feel small by someone in power. The quote went viral. Closure and heels became a phrase people used, a meme, a symbol. I received hundreds of messages from women and men who'd experienced similar situations, who'd been underestimated, who'd been told they'd never amount to anything by people who should have been mentors instead of obstacles. Sometimes, late at night in my office, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed quiet that day. He spilled coffee on my report. If I'd laughed along with his jokes. If I'd accepted his assessment that I'd never rise. The thought makes me grateful for his cruelty in a strange way. Every insult had been a lesson in what not to become. Every sneer had been a blueprint of the kind of leader I'd never be. Every moment of humiliation had been fuel for a fire that eventually consumed his empire and built something better from the ashes. He'd built the walls that confined me. But in doing so, he'd also taught me exactly where the cracks were, where the weaknesses existed, and how the whole structure could be dismantled. A year after the retirement party, I visited Cliff's old office, now mine. Same window view overlooking the city, same mahogany desk, same leather chair. But it smelled different now. Not of his expensive cologne and barely concealed whiskey breath. Not of arrogance and fear masked as confidence. It smelled like lavender from the diffuser my assistant kept running. Like fresh coffee from a machine that actually worked. Like the cinnamon candles I burned during long evenings working on strategy. It smelled like ambition mixed with purpose, like hard work meeting opportunity, like the future instead of the past. I'd kept exactly one thing from his tenure, a small photo on the shelf of the company's founding team from 30 years ago. Young faces full of hope and vision, before politics and power corrupted the mission. That photo reminded me why I was here, not to replace one ego with another, but to return the company to its original purpose. At our annual all-hands meeting, I stood before 300 employees, some who'd survived Cliff's regime, many who'd joined since his departure. The conference room smelled like coffee and possibility. "We don't rise by mocking others," I said, my voice carrying to the back row. "We rise by remembering who we once were, what challenges we've overcome, and using that memory to create spaces where others can rise too. This company's greatest asset isn't our contracts or our reputation. It's the dignity we give every person who works here." The room applauded. I thought of Cliff, wherever he was now, probably at another company, starting over, hopefully learning. I didn't wish him harm. I wished him growth. The kind of growth that only comes from having your worst assumptions about yourself proven true, then choosing to become better. He'd invited me to that retirement party to humiliate me one final time. To prove that I'd never amount to anything without him. To show everyone that assistants stayed assistants and bosses stayed bosses and the natural order of his universe was unchangeable. Instead, he'd introduced me to my destiny. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't destroying your enemy. It's simply taking their seat and doing the job so much better that everyone forgets they ever sat there in the first place. And as I looked out at my team, diverse, talented, driven, I realized something profound. This wasn't revenge at all. This was a restoration. Of dignity. Of purpose. Of what leadership should have been all along. Cliff's legacy was cruelty. Mine would be creating a place where talent mattered more than ego, where character counted more than connections, where the measure of success was how many people you lifted up rather than how many you pushed down. The champagne glass that shattered on the ballroom floor that night? That was the sound of the old world breaking. The applause that followed? That was the sound of a new one being born. Like and subscribe for more.